As we enter the bitter, darker winter months, it's natural to sometimes feel a sense of weariness and unease amongst the general chaos of preparing ourselves for the end of year season. And I think if there's one forgotten and underappreciated film that softly captures the essence of this feeling, it's 1998's supernatural thriller Fallen. Released during the notorious winter dump month, Fallen was met with a poor critical and box office reception, despite the immense star power of its lead actor Denzel Washington, along with a supporting role from our Lord and Savior John Goodman.
Maybe it's God, huh?
It tells the story of a Philadelphia police detective called John Hobbs, as he investigates a series of cryptic riddles found at various random murder scenes that bear a remarkable resemblance to those committed by a recently executed serial killer called Edgar Reese. At first, John and his partner Jonesy suspect a copycat killer, but things quickly spiral into the unorthodox, as John soon discovers that all the clues lead to a mysterious body-shifting entity known as Azazel.
Evil spirit of the wilderness, whatever that means, huh?
When my host dies and I move a spirit, no man can resist me.
In many ways, Fallen, fell into the trend of peak 90s American neo-noir, specifically those that were looking to replicate the eerie, chilling approach used in the 1991 Best Picture winner The Silence of the Lambs. As covered before in both my videos on Andrew Kevin Walker's 7 and 8mm, the 90s was a strange transitional time, where films were growing much darker and cynical, sometimes leaving an uncertain bleakness that, while had existed long before, felt more in line with the societal fears of the impending new millennium that bled into horror movies of the early 21st century. In fact, credit where credit is due, while writing this, it reminded me of a message I received from a patron called Connor back in January, who suggested a super interesting topic I've never considered on the untold trend of late 90s man versus the devil style films. Connor put across the theory that films such as End of Day, Stigmata, The Devil's Advocate, and Event Horizon possibly played into Hollywood looking to capitalize on the fear-mongering anomaly of the Y2K millennium bug that basically created this anxious hysteria that the world was just going to end, as if this doomsday rapture was upon us. The thing is, when taking this idea into account, it makes total sense in the context of Fallen, as it dwells subtly on the idea of this invisible, unstoppable apocalypse that's happening all around us, but we're all just too busy or just don't care enough to notice. Whether you take that as literal or metaphorical towards our withering world, it's a film where the lingering feeling of death and damnation could not be any more present, as Azazel can unknowingly transfer from host to host through a mere simple touch, allowing it to instantly control the mind and body of the possessed into doing its devilish bidding.
Maybe if you figure it out, you die. You don't get to hang around anymore. You get promoted.
It is a badass concept for a supernatural thriller, because when you look at what demonic possession movies are today, there really is nothing quite like it. It's a haunting that isn't brash or convulsive. Azazel is deceptive, malevolent, and cunning. Like Pazuzu from The Exorcist, it gains pleasure more so from messing with those around it and by hiding in plain sight, using its innocent host to protect itself while making everyone around it feel terrified and hopeless. It's like a demonic Loki by being a gleeful trickster and yet still menacingly focused. However, as we'll come to see, it's not as powerful as it pretends to be, as John slowly begins to use his own cunningness to outsmart Azazel into finally revealing itself.
I knew you'd come.
If there's one thing that is prominent about Fallen, it's that you will never hear the song Time Is On My Side by the Rolling Stones in the same way again, because not only does it grow ever more menacing each time a possessed character sings it, but it essentially carries the brooding theme of the story. Hell, the only thing scarier in the film is James Gandolfini having a mustache that would make Detective Hercule Poirot blush. It opens with your typical noir flashback framing device, where John narrates to the audience plot about what he calls the time that he almost died, transitioning us back to the night that serial killer Edgar Reese is executed. The tone set in the opening 10 minutes is strikingly enigmatic. We see John agonizingly running away from something unseen, while Edgar Reese's threatening obsession with him, followed by his strangely joyful dance towards his own death, gives an unnatural emotional contrast to the morbid solitude of both the prison and cabin setting. You could say that the film attempts to maintain a very mundane, naturalistic feel that's made increasingly uncomfortable by Azazel's poisonous otherworldly presence. In fact, to blatantly reinforce this symbolism, not only is Edgar Reese executed by poisonous lethal gas, but when John and Jonesy later start investigating the copycat killings, each victim is killed by poisonous injection, suggested to be Reese's signature method of murder. Following his death, Azazel is released and begins transmitting itself through random individuals before eventually stalking John for an unknown reason. Although, it is worth bearing in mind if you're interested in watching it that it isn't really until the second half where we begin to sense the tangible urgency of Azazel's ultimate motive. Admittedly, the first half can be a bit of a monotonous slog at times. It's a dialogue-heavy, slow-burning police procedural that's plainly by the numbers both structurally and stylistically, and is elevated largely by the strength of its charismatic cast. While things do begin to dramatically lighten up, as we'll come to see, once it embraces the supernatural elements and evolves into a thrilling cat-and-mouse chase, Fallen does unfortunately feel like a relatively cheap made-for-TV movie at times, rather than a $46 million Hollywood production. I mean, it will come as no surprise that when I looked up the director, Gregory King Hoblet, yes that is his name, I discovered that he works predominantly in television, so the flat, matter-of-fact visuals and delivery kinda makes sense in that department. Although at the same time, you could justify the cold, stiff look as reflective of the story and mood of the characters, in the same way it worked for Hoblet's previous major production Primal Fear, which was a stern and clinical courtroom drama that emphasized the need for composure and formal appearances when defending yourself in court. There is a point where John's acceptance to the existence of larger, more powerful forces does make the atmosphere feel like time is standing still, echoing the song Time Is On My Side, sung perpetually by Azazel, who enjoys relishing in its seemingly infinite existence to do whatever it wants compared to John and his fracturing composure, igniting a sense of urgency to stop it before it succeeds at whatever it's up to. Now, I'm about to address what Azazel itself actually is, so this could be spoilery to those who want to watch the film blind, but don't worry, I won't give away the grand heart-racing finale just yet. In the film, Azazel isn't given an extensive explanation compared to the varying accounts in biblical text, but according to Britannica, the simplest way to describe Azazel was as a fallen angel who symbolized a scapegoat, a literal goat in fact, bearing the sins of the Jewish people. In other words, Azazel was a parasite of sin, one that absorbed all the badness that humanity then banished away so that it couldn't be spread like a disease, becoming what Britannica calls a personification of uncleanness that couldn't simply be destroyed. According to Ida Satelli's journal on the scapegoat ritual, a significant point about transferring these sins was that the literal goat was not killed, but rather released into a remote and desolate place, never to return. Keep this in mind because it does play a role later in the story, but what John soon discovers is that Azazel potentially isn't the only fallen angel out there, as he finds a book that prophesizes the fall of Babylon, or rather the end of civilization.
Some of these angels were cast down, and a few of the fallen were punished by being deprived of form. They can only survive in the bodies of others. It's inside of us their vengeance is played out.
Yeah, it basically turns a small-scale thriller into a potential end-of-the-world disaster, making the stakes just a little more intense than initially assumed. It more or less leads to a scene late in the story where John and Jonesy end up having an existential discussion about the meaning of life after realizing nothing in their world makes sense anymore, despite decades of investigating violence and wickedness.
I have a hard time believing that we're part of some huge
moral experiment, conducted by a greater being than us.
There's even this mild sense of inevitability that begins to seep its way in, as John learns that stopping Azazel isn't going to stop other forms of evil that lurk all around us, thus expanding a fairly low-key story into one part of a more complex universe. As John's fears intensify, he befriends the daughter of a deceased detective called Greta, who explains how her father killed himself in a remote cabin in 1966, presumably out of guilt or to avoid prosecution after being blamed for a series of murders identical to the ones John is investigating. The reality is that Azazel has evidently been surviving for potentially centuries, and going into the final act of the story, this is where things take a thrilling turning point. Ending spoilers to those who wish to watch the film for themselves, but come back after because the ending is kinda bonkers. When I said the song Time Is On My Side is the central theme of the story, it really comes to light when John discovers that Azazel isn't the unstoppable Time Lord it claims to be, as once Azazel is forced outside the body of its host following their death, it has a finite amount of time to find a new host, the length of a single breath to be exact. It's a very subtle but profound weakness, as it highlights Azazel as more of a minion threat than this big bad that it insinuates itself to be.
We believe that God limited demons and made them mortal.
So now these demons are mortal. They can be killed.
As I said, it's like a demonic Loki. It's a total big mouth bullshitter with an ability that isn't so much a power as it is merely a means of self-preservation to desperately shield its natural vulnerability. It dies the same way we do, when it basically stops breathing.
If when he's in spirit form, he's fighting for his life.
John's eventual plan perfectly mirrors exactly what sources claim happens to the scapegoat. He attempts to lure Azazel out to the same cabin used by the 1966 detective, who we discover didn't kill himself out of guilt or evasion, but rather was attempting to isolate Azazel far away from a living host so it cannot survive. By this point, John has also been blamed for the murders he's been investigating, as Azazel tricks him into killing an innocent man and proceeds to possess other people in an effort to frame him. It leads to John's lieutenant and partner Jonesy confronting him at the cabin, where one of them is possessed. But what is incredibly fascinating, but also horribly sad about the final confrontation, is that it's presented as this bleak, exhausted last stand where, regardless of John's victory, the scene makes it clear that not only does he have to die, but he has to murder his own colleagues and still go down being blamed for all the other murders, since Azazel's existence goes completely unnoticed.
I'm sorry, Jonesy.
It becomes another wrongful tragedy that's only given a glimmer of satisfaction, from John getting the final say by ironically mocking Azazel with its own song while ingesting its own poison, as Azazel realizes that time is no longer on its side. However, it's not over yet, because this movie pulls one of the biggest kicks in the balls I have ever experienced that's very in line with Arlington Road. And if you know what I'm referencing with that, I don't need to tell you to brace yourself. So, I think it's implied earlier in the story that John is potentially one of the chosen few destined to stop demons from ravaging Earth, as Azazel is unable to transfer into John's body when making contact with him at the beginning of the movie. It seems to be that only when John is weakened both physically and spiritually can Azazel then take control, to which he does before being forced out after John dies. Yet, some of you might recall that I quoted a line from the opening narration in which John says he's going to tell us the story about the time he almost died. That wasn't a typo. Azazel locks out by possessing a fucking cat beneath the cabin and escaping. Thus, all of this was not only for nothing, but insinuates that the story was technically told from Azazel's perspective.
Oh, you forgot something, didn't you?
Being the bastard trickster that he is, Azazel still gets the final laugh, and the film ends with the same happy, gleeful mood Edgar Ross had when walking to his own execution. This is Azazel's personal mic drop to the audience. It's his gratifying victory, and it is absolutely fucking genius. And with that, we come to an end. Regardless of spoilers, if you've made it this far, I do sincerely hope you check it out for yourself, and if you have seen it, please make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, stay safe, stay away from people, I mean, social distancing is still a thing, and I'll see you all next time.